Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the third episode of liberalism, understanding it and understanding its functionalities, inshallah. Today's objectives are going to be three in number. Number one, to know the key developments in international law and human rights. Number two, to understand how such developments have shaped our world. And number three, to be able to make a judgment on the morality of human rights. Now, in the previous episode, we talked about the development of human rights, and we talked about the epistemology of liberalism in the episode before that. And all of those things are actually very much connected. As I'd like to kind of repeat here, human rights is an outgrowth of liberalism. So you can't have human rights without liberalism, and liberalism itself is based on axioms, which means it's based on non-evidences, no evidence. An axiom is something which is believed without evidences. And to be specific, it's based on the axiom of the hedonistic principle, the idea that you can pretty much do anything which feeds into your pleasure, and you should try and avoid as many things that are painful as possible. This hedonistic principle of John Locke was developed by thinkers like Jeremy Bentham, and in what was then referred to as utilitarianism, and then taken on board by people like John Stuart Mill, and made and refined into the Hum principle. So all of those things we've kind of already covered, and we started talking about human rights, and we said that human rights was not a term that was used in the beginning to denote a set of rights that human beings have. That phraseology was only used after 1948 in particular. After World War II, which ended in 1945. So, since human rights are such a big deal in today's society, we will be looking at human rights. So, the first thing we're looking at is before World War II. Now, before World War II, you had a few things which should be put into a timeline. So, as I already told you guys, if I mention key historical dates, the best thing to do is to open up your books and to have a timeline there so that you can track those dates more accessibly, more easily. The first key date you want to put down is 1814. And then you had a Treaty of Paris. It's called the Treaty of Paris, which obviously was about 100 years before World War I. In 1926, you had the International Slavery Convention. Don't forget, guys, slavery was abolished around 1807 in the United Kingdom and around 1865 in the United States, obviously after the American Civil War, which took place in 1861 to 1865. So slavery legally was abolished from a legal perspective in the mid 1800s, respective to America, mid to late 1800s, respective, and the early 1800s in the United Kingdom. So you had the International Slavery Convention in 1926, which is like 7 years or 8 years after World War I. The establishment of the International Labour Association in 1919, and of course, a very important thing here, which I'm going to underline, is the establishment of the League of Nations. Now, this is an important historical development because the League of Nations would then would be seen as a weak organization in the first instance, and then be rebranded, if you like, or changed into the United Nations after World War II. So these historical developments are very important, and you should have that kind of as a timeline understanding, so you can refer to it when we're making reference to other ideas. So as we said, after World War II, the UN was started, and the purposes of the UN is to develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, and to achieve international cooperation in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. Now, let's take this purposes of the UN and let's play around with it for a little bit. Let's think about it, because in the previous session, we did a bit of an information overload. It was a bit of an information dump. In this lesson, it's more of a thinking exercise. It's less knowledge input and more kind of mental exercise. Requires a little bit more brain juice, if you like. Now, let's think about this. Well, you're going to use the annotation tools here, so to look at the screen. We're going to highlight some of the key words. Friendly relations among nations. Okay, so the existence of nation states. So each nation, I should actually delete that and write it again because that was actually written very bad. Each nation is to maintain its sovereignty. And a sovereign is a self-governed nation in this context, on respect of the principles of equal rights. Now, equal rights, this is a very interesting construction. What do we actually mean by equal rights? You should go to your keywords and obviously write equality. Now, equality is of two kinds usually. Equality of opportunity, number one, and equality of outcome. So whenever someone speaks to you in terms of equality, you've got to ask them, what do you mean? Do you mean equality of opportunity or equality of outcome? The liberal principles, as we've already kind of seen, it presupposes the existence or the natural birth of people as equal in terms of citizens. In the two truths of government, actually, John Locke was talking about this, and quite contradictorily, he mentioned that people can be born differently. For example, some people can be born with defects and so on, but they're still equal. So what was he? Why is it on prima facie value? Why is it a contradiction? Because obviously, if one person is born with two arms and another person is born with one arm, there's no equality between those individuals. If someone is born seeing and the other person is born blind, where's the equality in that? And so the idea is, as far as my reading goes of John Locke, is that actually it's equal in value. As if there's a value which intrinsically inheres in human beings, which is the same. So if we all had a value attached to us, it would be the same value. But what is that based on? That's based on theological understandings, presuppositions, and axioms. It's not something which is necessarily found out from first principles. How can you prove, the question would be, that people are born equal? John Locke didn't try to put this kind of statement in a vacuum. He put it in the context of a theological underpinning. So obviously, when we talk about human beings being born equal, the question is, on a physical material level, we're not born equal. And it's as simple as that. On materialism, for instance, we're not born equal. Some of us are born taller, some of us are born shorter, some of us are born with one arm, some of so the conjoined twins. It must be about the value of human being. But if it's about the value of human being, who is the valuer? If there's a value without valuation, then what is the value of that value? It must be a subjective value or some kind of fictitious one, frankly, mythological. It's liberal fiction, liberal myth. And you're right. It says, and self-determination of people. So self-determination is an implicit reference to a prerequisite of democracy. So the understanding or the belief that human beings should basically choose their own fates. And encouraging respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Fundamental freedoms as if they are, once again, universally understood. But are they universally understood? Or were they formulated by, for the most part, the Western overlord? That's a question that we'll come back to, inshallah. Alright. So we've just come on the, as you can see here, guys. This is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Um, so we're looking at the declaration, and this is what it looks like. So it's good sometimes to see primary source materials. It's quite a straightforward one. You can obviously access this yourself, and if you're watching with me, I recommend that you do watch this. That you do go through this with me. Uh, we're going to go through each of the human rights. As you can see here, guys, there are 30 articles, and they're kind of very small, and we can go through them quite quickly. And by the way, this session is not intended to be a persuasive one. It's meant to be more of an informative one. In other words, I'm not making any particular case at this stage. This is just these are just the prerequisite knowledge items that you need to be acquainted with before any case could possibly be made. So let's take a look at them. First one, all humans are born free and equal in dignity and rights. So we've already talked about this, and we said the question is, how do we ascertain that on naturalism? How do we ascertain the fact that all humans are born equal and free in dignity and rights? Are we talking about naturalistic equality? Because naturalistic equality actually doesn't exist, especially if you're talking about 7 billion people living on the face of the earth. So this is not something that can actually be empirically verified from a scientific perspective. It's something which is actually metaphysical. You could say religious. It's a religious belief that all human beings are born equal in dignity and rights. Now, whether that's a good or bad religious belief is not something I'm making an argument for, but it's just simply something which is unsubstantiated on physicalism. And number 2, everyone is entitled to all the rights and the freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, colour, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth or other status. Furthermore, no distinction shall be made on the basis of the political, jurisdictional or international status of the country or territory to which a person belongs, whether it be independent, trust, non-self-governing or under any other limitation of sovereignty. So it's saying that, and this brings forward the problem of, can I write on it? No, I can't. This brings forward the issue of enforcement. The question is, if this applies to every country, there is a seeming conflict here, isn't there, between the sovereignty of that nation on the one hand, but on the other hand, the enforcement of this international law. How can national sovereignty be maintained whilst at the same time international law is meant to be enforced? This is an issue, and obviously it's exacerbated this issue when you have UN, which has disproportionate representation, where the United States of America is represented more than other states, especially considering the population size, which is quite big in America, but relative to China, for example, is much smaller, yet the proportional representation of China in the UN is much less. So these are issues that people have spoken about and complained about, and I would say rightly so, which indicate that the United Nations has been touched by the American influence a little bit more than other countries. Moving on to the third thing here, as you can see, smiley faces and all that, different colours of people. Everyone has the right to life, liberty and security of person. It's almost as if they've taken that straight from John Locke. And it's really interesting because the question is, to what extent? And obviously, who is everyone? Are there really exceptions to this? Because we know that many countries that claim to be liberal do have the death penalty. And so obviously criminals of a certain predisposition or who have gone through or have committed certain crimes would not be subject to the same rules here. Liberty and security of person, obviously security of person, if a country decides that it wants to go into another country, that's war. And war is an institution of death. And by nature, you're taking that right away from other people. This is the question of human rights. And this brings us to this issue of the feasibility and implementability of human rights. Is it even possible that these things can be included and given to all human beings on an equal footing, some would say, no, human rights from this perspective are actually utopian rights, impossible rights, to exist in a world where you have different geopolitical, social and economic forces at odds with each other, a world of war, a world of conflict. So human rights is the impossible standard, one could argue. Impossible when all things are considered. Number 4, no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. But of course, one could argue that, and the Marxists would argue this, that capitalism and slavery are two sides of the same coin. That in other words, wherever capitalism exists, slavery exists as well. I mean, depending on how one defines slavery, there can be a case that slavery exists as a result of someone not having the freedom to do what they want to do. Take, for example, the example of someone who's a worker, a low level skilled worker, and they work in, for example, let's say China or Bangladesh or one of those countries in which transnational corporations kind of forcibly put people in positions of desperation. And they don't have any other option but to work in that place because there is simply a lacking of options. Now, if they leave the place, they starve. And if they continue to work, they'll be paid at a very low wage. Now, some will argue, and some have argued, that this is a kind of slavery, but it's acquiesced to by the capitalistic orders because, frankly, it feeds into their social, political, and economic narrative of meritocracy. So it could be argued that slavery, depending on the definition it takes different forms, and you can never escape kinds of slavery. So once again, this brings back this theme of utopia. Is it actually even possible to have these human rights implemented? Are they even feasible in the real world? These are very important questions. So we're doing tafsir of the human rights, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, a sharh, like Nawawi's 40 hadith for those Muslim listeners that I'm sure are familiar with what I'm talking about. No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment or punishment. Well, here's the thing. How do we define those terms? And the question is, and the answer is, the definition of those terms, cruel and inhumane and so on, will always be made by the governments at hand. It will always be made through the social contract, through national security lenses, by government. So it's very nice saying that, but the definitions, the actual technical legal definitions, are to be determined by the government. So it's almost as if saying, well, you can do whatever you want, except for the things I'm telling you you can't do. Of course, there are living examples like Guantanamo Bay and all that stuff, which is a severe thorn in the side of those who talk about human rights on a practical level in America. Everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. Well, they should say that to Shamima Begum, who has been made stateless and, really no one even mentioned Article 6 of the Human Rights in that discussion. However, the point is, everyone has a right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. What law? It's this law that they're talking about, or the law of the land. And of course, this is just an abstract kind of statement. 2 lines. Not much can be made out of this. You see, look, they're 2 different sizes, but they weigh the same, which is actually factually on naturalism. That kind of illustration is impossible. All are equal before the law, and all are entitled without any discrimination to equal protection of the law. All are entitled to equal protection against any discrimination in violation of this declaration and against any incitement to such discrimination. Of course, this is highly malleable kind of article. Is everyone equal before the law? Should that be the case? I mean, that's actually something which people, liberals themselves, would disagree on, because it's not as easy as it looks. I mean, on prima facie value, it's quite straightforward, right? Everyone's equal before the law. However, in reality, Not everyone is equal before the law. If someone has committed crimes before, many countries take that into consideration in their jurisdiction, in their judicial system. So, in other words, if you have committed offences before, the way you're going to be looked at as a person, as a subject, is going to be different. Some countries, of course, they don't have that. Right. Everyone has the right to an effective remedy by the competent national tribunals of acts violating the fundamental rights granted him by constitution or by law. So once again, what constitution? Not every country has a codified constitution. Some do have codified ones, mean written ones. Some have uncodified ones. And so this is just trying to put forward that there should be, an escalation process in terms of the judicial system. And that makes some sense. Obviously, from a legal perspective, it's not something you can refute that easily. No one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. And this arbitrariness is actually quite important in liberal theory. And the reason why is because one of the main things which John Locke himself kind of made sure, that he really stressed this. And once again, you're seeing how documents, primary source documents, are affected by philosophical thought, going all the way back 600 years ago, medieval times. For those who don't believe that, there is a medieval influence on present day discourses, because whenever we talk about religion, it's always a medieval discourse. But no one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. So the arbitrariness there is important, the arbitrary element, because John Locke did stress that it's not about necessarily the law, but it's about how that law would be applicable to different peoples. And what's really connected to this and important to this is the concept of minority rights. So minorities, it's not about them having just rights, it's making sure that their rights are in line with everyone else's rights in terms of society. And that's an important thing for Muslim minorities, Jewish minorities, and other minorities, to know that if there is a policy which seemingly discriminates against a particular minority group, that policy is against many different principles of liberalism. One of them is, obviously, tyranny of majority is one of them. You try and avoid tyranny of majority. But another one is arbitrariness and arbitrary arrest or arbitrary treatment of different groups in society. That's illiberal. Article 10. Everyone is entitled in full equality to a fair and public hearing by an independent and impartial tribunal in the determination of his rights and obligations and of any criminal charge against him. So this is important because it's talking about how, and this is one of the only articles that we're finding the words rights and obligations. Usually if we go back, you're not going to find those two words together. It's a lot of it is just about rights and not about responsibility or obligations. This is Article 10. It's interesting because it's mentioning the word obligations. I usually don't find that. That's one of the communitarian criticisms of UN human rights. Everyone is entitled to full equality to a fair and public hearing by an independent and impartial tribunal in determination of his rights. And this goes back to kind of what we were talking about before, equality before the law. Everyone charged with a penal offence has the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty, according to law, in public trial, at which he has had all the guarantees necessary for his defence. And by the way, this is something which is very universal. I mean, when we use this word, we do mean it in a broad stroke sense, because frankly, the idea of being innocent before being proven guilty is even in, for example, Islamic jurisprudence. It's in Jewish jurisprudence. It's in many different forms. It comes in different forms, and it predates religion in the traditional sense of the word, you could argue. But obviously, you could say religion was always there from our Islamic perspective. That's what we believe. But but certainly it predates Abrahamic religion, or you could say coexisted with it. No one shall be held guilty of any penal offence on account of any act or omission which did not constitute a penal offence. So this is connected, quite straightforward. No one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home or correspondence, nor to attacks upon his honour and reputation. Everyone has the right to protection of the law against such interference or attacks. Now, of course, you could ask yourself, well, does this even, Article 12 here, is it even in line with freedom of speech and freedom of expression? How could you say on the one hand that honour and reputation can be protected, should be protected, which is here in Article 12, but at the same time freedom of speech in some cases should be left? So honour and reputation, you could argue, well, I mean, if you attack my religious belief, isn't this an attack on my honour? Isn't this an attack on my person, on my reputation? If you attack this group, if you're saying something about this group of people, my lineage or my family, isn't this an attack on my honour? Obviously, usually in these arguments, freedom of speech usually triumphs. But the question is why, and why have they put this in there to create such confusion if this is the case? Number 13, everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. And everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. Of course, this is something which is very difficult to enforce. And unless they wanted to have the right to go into countries and move people around forcibly, which once again would contradict the sovereignty of a state, then this article once again would be problematic when we're talking about the sovereignty of nations. Number 14, everyone has the right to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. This right may be invoked in cases of persecutions genuinely arising from non-political crimes or from acts contrary to the purpose and principles of the United Nations. Really, you're seeing how, with that second proposition there, that the principles are seen as really universalizing. Anything that goes against these principles must be, must be done away with. Number 15, everyone has the right to a nationality. Well, who's going to enforce that? Once again, is the UN going to provide a nationality if the sovereign state decides not to? Is it going to force the sovereign state to provide a nationality? Once again, the case of Shamima Begum comes up. It's quite an interesting one. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his nationality or denied the right to change his nationality. So obviously we have precedents of that actually happening, but usually Article 15 is not invoked. Men and women of full age without any limitation due to race, nationality or religion have the right to marry and to found a family. They are entitled to equal rights as to marriage during marriage and its dissolution. Marriage should be entered into only with the free will and full consent of the intended spouses. The family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection by society. And obviously that third thing there has been opposed massively now after the 60s, especially with different gender theories about what is a man, what is a woman, what is a family. Article 17, everyone has the right to own property alone as well as association with others. No one be arbitrarily deprived of his property. One of the words that keep coming up is arbitrarily or arbitrariness. Now arbitrariness, as we said before, is doing it almost haphazardly, applying law haphazardly, inconsistently, incoherently, and that is something which does in fact go all the way back to John Locke, and we've talked about that. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, consciousness and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others and in public or private to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship and observance. And the question is, on the point of freedom of consciousness and religion, I mean, what does it actually mean? When you have freedom of religion, but then if that religion or those religious practices, because a religion is a totality of the practices and beliefs which are pertained within that religion. What if those practices go against the law of the land, for example? And what if those practices go against the UN Declaration of Human Rights? So there are many layers of potential contradictions and tensions that exist there. In terms of changing one's religion and so on. Now, we talked about this before in one of the YouTube videos I did about the law of apostasy according to John Locke. Now, John Locke says in his book on tolerance that if a state is recognized as religious, like for example a Jewish state, and someone changes their religion, this is seen as a kind of treason. And this is something quite important and interesting because we will go into this as a separate argument. Is it the case really that there's any difference between a social contract predicated on religious grounds to one that's predicated on, for instance, nationalistic grounds? So for example, in other words, if treason is the rupturing of a social contract by someone who goes against the state in malice or in maliciousness, or if, for example, trying to counter that state, then could that be predicated on both nationalistic, as secular, as well as so-called secular, as well as traditional religious grounds? And is there any epistemic difference between those two things? That's something which we will be revisiting, which is an important thing. And by the way, guys, I'm writing something at the end of this year, before the end, inshallah, like October. There will be a book about this, Liberalism and Islam. It will be a very short book, but hopefully with some of the main ideas about these themes that we're talking about, especially in relation to human rights in Islam, because I think there does need to be this kind of putting together of those ideas for us to have a better understanding. Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference, to seek, receive, and impart information, ideas through any media, and regardless of frontiers. Now, obviously, every state, with this 19th article, decides where the borders of freedom of expression is, where the borders of freedom of speech are. Obviously, hate speech is a disputed term, but things like, for incitement to terrorism or incitement to, for example, paedophilia, or incitement to something which is seen as absolutely unacceptable. Child pornography in and of itself is not within the remit of, acceptable freedom of expression, and therefore is outlawed, censored in society. So usually if someone, for example, wanted to make a video explaining how to make poison gas and put it on YouTube, or how to make a bomb, it wouldn't be an easy thing for society to permit. So freedom of expression and belief are always curtailed by security concerns. And in some countries, frankly, they even do it on racial and historical grounds. Like there was many cases that we can kind of cite in future episodes, inshallah, about Holocaust denial and how it leads to court cases and so on. And also labeling black people in certain ways, labeling other people from different countries in certain ways. The Public Order Act, I think it's 2005 in the UK. There are principles. If you do and say certain things, racism is illegal in this country. And so almost every so-called civilized society has its borders for what freedom of speech is and so on. Everyone has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. No one may be compelled to belong to an association. So once again, this is talking about, protesting and so on. And this is the extent to which it's entrenched in Western culture. Obviously, the reason why they did this is because, the US influence in particular. I mean, the United States of America was founded upon resistance against the British. And so, obviously, you could also argue the same thing with France, not against the British this time, but against the aristocracy, against the middle classes, the bourgeoisie, if you like. And so, from that perspective, there's this deep entrenchment of this idea of protesting as a form of political expression. Article 21. Everyone has the right to take part in the government of his country directly or through freely chosen representatives. So here it's kind of dictating that democracy should be the modus operandum of a particular country. Number 2 says everyone has the right to equal access to public services in his country. And obviously this is not the case in America. I mean, you don't have free healthcare, for instance. Public services must include, if you want to be completely fair, all the aspects of public services, including hospitals. But that isn't the case in America. The will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. This shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage, and shall be held by secret vote or by equivalent free voting procedures. So it's spelling out exactly how they want their representative democracy to take place. And this, of course, is a very, to be frank with you guys, I mean, it's not. It was never like this. This is a completely different topic, but the idea of a direct democracy, which first existed in Athens, and then it's kind of morphing or developing into a representative type democracy when population sizes became massive, and obviously referendums weren't possible on every issue. But that whole movement was not just a movement that took place over hundreds of years. I mean, even in American history, you didn't have that kind of elaborate representative democracy. You had what you call smoke-filled rooms. You had the electoral council. You had layers of different decision-making, different people that were making decision-making without the consultation of the electorate. So I think that it's quite simplistic to assume that representative democracy has always been there. Obviously, this is 1948, and so all of those developments, if you like, are represented in this article. Everyone as a member of society has the right to social security and is entitled to realization through national effort and international cooperation, and in accordance with the organization and resource of each state of the economic, social and cultural rights indispensable for his dignity and free development of his personality. So this is quite a long one. Usually articles are quite straight to the point. But this is Article 22, and it says, everyone as a member has the right to social security. So that's the first point. So obviously here we're talking about police and going back to kind of public services. And is entitled to realization through national effort and international cooperation. Now, look at this. National effort and international cooperation. What do they actually mean by international cooperation? We're talking about the structures of hegemonic power. Because naturally what will happen is international cooperation is what they mean by the powers that be in the UN, which are dominated and will be dominated, continue to be dominated by the United States of America. So in other words, they're saying, we are the world police. And if you don't do it yourselves, we might do it for you. Article 23, everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favourable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. Very capitalistic type thing. Everyone's entitled to it. They're not saying everyone should do it. And once again, you're seeing the word right come up over and over again. You have the right to work, the right to work. What about the word responsibility? We only saw the word obligation come once. And this, once again, I want to draw your attention to the critique that communitarians have. They say, look, this is all a rights-based culture. You're just telling people what they should get, what they're entitled to. And by extension, that makes them quite entitled. But it doesn't tell them, what they should be doing. Because if you look at religious discourses, let's take the Quranic discourse as an example, right? It's a lot more obligation, responsibility based. You've got to do this and you've got to do that, and you can't do this and you can't. Here, it's just telling people what they should be getting. So it's a completely different kind of kettle of fish in terms of entitlement kind of thing. And what does that produce? One could argue, as communitarians do argue, that it produces an entitlement culture, a culture of receiving, of selfishness, of ego, of let me get and not give, let me have and not, let me take, let me have, let me get, rather than let me give, let me contribute, and let me give. So here, number 2 is, everyone, without any discrimination, has the right to equal pay for equal work. And of course, what do they actually mean by this? They mean, if you're doing the same job, you should get the same money. But this is a very, very simplistic overview of the equality, premise. Because if we think about it, what if someone has more experience? What if someone has more qualifications? What if someone's time is worth more due to their experience? I mean, this is certainly not carried out in the West, I'll tell you that for sure. On capitalism, someone could be working as an actress, or an actor, both of them working the same hours but getting completely different money. One person could be working as a football player, another person working as and they get completely different. So really and truly, this is an interesting thing. Without caveating it and regulating it and kind of refining it, number 2 of Article 23 here could be to be more in line with almost communism, frankly, than anything else. Everyone, or socialism, you could argue. Everyone who works has the right to just and favourable remuneration, ensuring for himself and his family an existence worthy of human dignity, and supplemented, if necessary, by other means of social protection. You can see here some traditionalist talking about social dignity, and talking about human dignity, and the family unit. This is the second or third mentioning of the family unit, without any rights being designated. Now, what's quite interesting about the human rights the Convention of Human Rights, is you don't find that there are any rights afforded to parents, for example. So it doesn't say in one of the articles, mothers have the right to be obeyed by their children, for example. Now, you'd think that it goes without saying, but certainly the right to life, property, and protection should go without saying for a lot of people, right? But why is it not mentioned in the United Nations Convention, for example, that mothers should be, given good treatment? And these kind of omissions, you could argue, it fuels the problem in terms of societal ignorance and societal selfishness, entitlement schemes that people have in family settings and so on, because they don't feel like they need to give anything. It's not a human right. It's not within the language of human rights. It's never been within the language of human rights to give parents their rights. Though the family is mentioned, not much is being said about the inner workings of the family. So everyone has the right to form and join trade unions for the protection of his interests, which goes without, saying. Everyone has the right to rest and leisure, including reasonable limitation of working hours and periodic holidays with pay. That's something which, once again, is interesting that they're getting involved in that sphere. And they got a nice picture of someone there, one leg down, We're in Article 25, guys. We've got 5 more articles left. I know it's been quite a long session, but sometimes we just have to, do what we have to do. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for health and for well-being and for himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing and medical care and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. So it's kind of asking the government to be redistributive. What are you going to do, though, if a country decides that they don't want to have these redistribution measures? Once again, you have the question of enforcement. Motherhood and childhood are entitled to special care and assistance. All children, whether born in or out of wedlock, shall enjoy the same social protection. So this is the only, I believe this is the only mention of motherhood in Article 25, and it's not saying that mothers have special care from their children or from other members of society. It's talking about from the government. So it's quite top down. As we can see, guys, this is a very top down type structure. But why is it not mentioning fatherhood? The question would be. Maybe there's sexism here. Obviously, a feminist. I've not seen a feminist reading of Human Rights Act, Human Rights Convention, which has refuted this kind of thing. Certainly, probably if it was the other way, there would have been some things that are written. Article 26. Everyone has the right to education. Education shall be free, at least in the elementary and fundamental stages. Elementary education shall be compulsory. Technical and professional education shall be made generally available, and higher education shall be, and you see there's a third shall be in the sentence, equally accessible to all on the basis of merit. So it's imposing capitalism, but at the same time imposing redistribution. But what if a country doesn't have the ability to have free education, doesn't have the money? It's a very kind of Eurocentric type thing here to say, because to be honest with you, not every country has the luxury of being able to divide its GDP in such a way as would allow for, certain aspects of education to be free. Sometimes there's poverty and death on a major level infant death, and that requires the urgent care. So education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. It shall promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among all nations, racial or religious groups, and shall further the activities of the United Nations for the maintenance of peace. Parents have the priority to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. I've looked at this before, and I thought about this, the case of the LGBTQ community's problem with, the Birmingham issue. The United Kingdom had an issue with, where certain children were taught at a very young age, homonormativity or homonormative type relationships, two men or two women or something like this, and obviously that was made to be quite accessible for the child, and so some Muslim parents came out and protested against it, and there was a social discussion about that. And obviously, if this has been taken seriously, no one actually even mentioned this, as far as I remember. The Article 26. Parents have the prior right to choose the kind of education that should be given to their children. Everyone has the right to freely to participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy arts, and to share the scientific advancements and its. Obviously, this is it's better off not even said, because how are you going to facilitate that? It's a non-facilitative type of article, which kind of just doesn't put much forward, if anything. Everyone has a right to the protection of the moral and material interests resulting from any scientific, literary, or artistic production of which he is the author. We've nearly finished the episode, guys. I know this is a long one. Everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in the Declaration can be fully realized. Everyone has duties to the community in which alone the free and full development of his personality is possible. One article where duties are mentioned. So you have one on obligations and one on duties. What duties there are, it's not specified at all. In the exercise of his rights and freedoms, everyone shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law solely for the purpose of securing due recognition and respect for the rights and freedoms of others, and of the meeting the just requirements of morality, public order, and general welfare in democratic society. These rights and freedoms may in no case be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Kingdom. So once again, you've got to be purposes and principles of the United Nations. Last but not least, probably you don't know if it's least or not, I'll leave that up to you to choose, to decide. Nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as implying for any state, group, or person any right to engage in any activity or to perform any act aimed at the destruction of any of the rights and freedoms set forth herein. So these are sacred rights, don't go near them. And guys, this has been more informative. I know I've put in some commentaries during our reading of these rights. It's important to know, we've read a whole kind of document together here, guys. It's important to go through some documents sometimes and to think critically about them. What I will say is, to end this discussion and to end this episode, this is the informative part ended. Okay, this is the informative part of the course ended. The next part of the course will be arguments set. So I'm going to give arguments now. I'm going to start making cases. I'm going to start making connections. I'm going to start reminding you of certain things that you've learned and connecting it with, the Muslim case. So it's going to be more in line with the book that I'm going to be releasing at the end of the year, which is going to be called Islam and Liberalism. Very straightforward title. But the question is, how now? What are the similarities and differences? What are the points of comparison between Islam and liberalism? And to what extent are human rights compatible with Islam? Islam compatible with human rights? Number 3, to what extent are the punitive laws of Islam compatible with liberalism and human rights? And vice versa. These are going to be some of the questions that we're going to be put forward. And the reason why we're doing this series is because most of the questions that we get asked as Muslims nowadays have a presupposition which is liberal. And now you should know why and how. And once you know the basis of liberalism, it'll be a much easier thing to track. So you can question the question, and inshallah, we'll be doing a lot more of that in the next part of this series. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.